These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. King David has solidified his hold on Israel, defeating the house of Saul, and the stories of the book of Samuel have covered pretty much the greatest triumphs of David's reign. And yet, we still have many more chapters of David reigning, and that's because for all of David's triumphs, he was not a sinless man, not even by the somewhat different standards of his own day. His tale is not one of unblemished moral purity, and today is when we see the meat of that. The Chronicles account omits some of the worst of David's failing because it's focused in a different area, but it still confirms enough of these accounts. Now we are starting in 2 Samuel chapter 10 for those following along at home. David has been ruling for a while and had some sort of treaty with the Ammonite king Nahash. Nahash seems to have died, as happens to most people at some point in their lives, and the thing about ancient treaties is that they didn't, as a rule, survive the death of the signatories. Once a king died, it was widely accepted that the heir was under no obligation to renew the treaty, and even if both sides were still interested in the treaty, it would need to be renewed for the new signatory. So we would assume that pretty much all of the neighbors of the Ammonites sent a diplomatic delegation to the court to express formal condolences and congratulations, all the boring things ambassadors still do nowadays, and also to offer a renewal or perhaps a renegotiation of the previous generation's treaties. And so, as a standard Near Eastern king, David does exactly this to the new king Hanun. However, it seems that the Ammonite court had some folks gossiping that David was actually planning to invade Ammonite territory. You know, the way he had so far been invading the territory of literally everyone he could reach. It may have been an unfounded rumor, but it wasn't an unreasonable one. And so Hanun, fearing a treaty would cause Israel to see Ammon as weak, and therefore incite an invasion of his territory, decided instead to humiliate David's delegation by shaving off half their beards and stealing their pants. I can kind of see what Hanun was kind of trying to get at, showing strength and ruthlessness in the hopes that he would avert an invasion. But he did a pretty bad job of it, and he caused David to invade Ammonite territory, the very thing Hanun was trying to avoid. Now, the Ammonites supposedly spent 75,000 pounds of silver to purchase 32,000 chariots from Mesopotamia, and this number is absurd, and it's also from Chronicles, which has a nasty habit of adding extra zeros to some numbers. There weren't that many chariots in the entire Near East among all the major powers in the late Bronze Age, and there certainly weren't that many for purchase at this point in a world much poorer than it was 4 centuries earlier. But apparently the Hebrew number system is often vague on place values, that's what people tell me, and dropping down to 3,200 chariots, especially when Samuel gives us the still a bit high but far more reasonable number of 20,000 Amorite infantry and 13,000 hired or allied infantry. Now 3,200 chariots in that context, it's a big old battle, but it's well in proportion to, 33,000 infantry? So 1 infantry for every 10 chariots about. That's high but reasonable. It's not crazy for a large battle. And as befitting a big battle, between Samuel and Chronicles, we get a pretty good set of details for this entire campaign. David, of course, sees the battle coming a mile away, and was clearly ready with an army of his own. So, maybe Hanun wasn't so unreasonable to think that David was planning for a war, especially if this is coming after the Philistine, Edomite, and Moabite wars, all of which would have established Israel as the major player in the land between the Arameans and the Egyptians. Anyway, David takes his army, he sends it out to meet the Amorite coalition, and the two armies meet somewhere around the town of Medeba. We don't get much sense of how big the Israelite army is. Now, given what happens, it may have been the slightly weaker force, but we can't really be sure. The Amorites draw up to defend the gates of their town, but the Aramean allies form camp out in a field at some distance from the town. Some see in all of this that the enemy may have been planning a classic hammer and anvil formation, where as soon as the Israelites attack the natural target, presumably the Amorites at the walls, the Arameans would come and attack them from behind. Indeed, Joab seems to see the potential for this very thing. Alternately, though, the town of Medeba was likely quite small, unable to support that many soldiers all at once, and the Arameans were probably further out just for supply reasons. Maybe they were in the fields foraging. Whatever the case, Joab and his army see the situation and develop a plan. Joab takes one wing of the army, the elite corps of warriors, while his brother and fellow general Abishai takes the smaller, weaker force. Step 1. Abishai goes over to the Amorites by the city walls, but doesn't quite engage them just yet. Just sort of gets there, threatens them, maybe a bit of skirmishing. Meanwhile, Joab makes for the allied army, which wasn't expecting to fight just yet, and so it makes the wise decision to pull back. Now, had Joab pressed the matter, there would have been a solid fight on the open field, but David's generals knew what they were doing. Seeing their allies pulling back from the battle, the Amorites appear to have panicked and started running themselves, only to be caught between Abishai's army near the city and Joab's army coming in from the fields. The ensuing battle does not appear to have been significant despite the numbers involved, just enough to make it clear that a victory was won there that day. Despite the victory, Joab returns to Jerusalem without pressing his gains. The victory was probably extremely minor, and the risk that if he tried to push, the enemy army could reform for a direct battle that might not go so well. I mean, the fact that this was avoided gives us an indication that the Israelites had taken a good look at the balance of forces and decided that maybe they wouldn't win a straight fight without any clever stratagems. And so half a year passes because this is probably the conclusion of the year's campaign season. For some ancient empires, the national logistical system becomes strong enough that war can be waged year-round, providing a significant advantage against smaller nations. But for most people, most of the time, and for the Israelites in their entire settled history, wars are waged only during campaign season, the period roughly after the harvest and before the planting, because that's when weather is favorable and, more importantly, when the labor is available. And so the Amorites prepare for the next campaign season by calling in more allies from the north, and David prepares by getting ready to gather all of Israel. Come the spring, David is the one who pushes, crossing the Jordan River and pressing deep into Amorite territory. He's met by a large force of Amorite and Arameans, unified this time into a single war host, and the ensuing battle seems to have involved little more than a press of one army against the other. The only sense we get for scale here is the claim to have defeated 700 chariots, which, if we take the earlier claim of 3,200 total chariots, is a pretty solid victory. That'd be 20% casualties plus the head of the enemy general. This battle, at the scale we posit here, would have been news all through the Near East. But we'll talk about the question of international recognition later. We'll also talk about horses later because Samuel claims that 40,000 horsemen were also killed in the battle, which is just a crazy high number of horses. But also, the history of cavalry is just now possibly beginning. And so the question of whether anyone was riding on actual horseback during the battle, which would represent a massive military innovation, is an open one. And it is one we're going to look at the Battle of Karkar, which is the first confirmed cavalry engagement in history. Up until now, we've had chariots, but no one's been riding the horses because they've been too small. I mean, no one's been riding the horses in warfare. Probably you get some small guy on top of the horse riding around, doing whatever. Anyway, you get my point. Part of the reason we won't look at this too deeply is because Chronicles corrects that to 40,000 infantry defeated, which is really high. The Battle of Kadesh may have had that many on each side, but that was the greatest battle of the greatest empires of the Bronze Age. Two regional powers, even expansionist ones, just don't have that kind of manpower to throw around. Anyway, a victory was won here, a very solid one, and so solid that the Amorites become vassals of Israel, and the Arameans of Syria no longer bother getting involved, seeing Israel as too significant a power to engage with, at least for a generation or so. And this is where the story gets weird, like really weird on a lot of levels. Having now subjugated the Ammonites with a treaty of vassalage and stripped them of their allies, the next thing we hear is that Joab, under David's orders, takes the army and lays siege to Rabbah. Now, fun fact here, Rabbah is the Ammonite capital, and the city still exists. It's called Ammon today, named for being the capital of the Ammonite nation that, it was ruled from there. Ammon, of course, is now the capital of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, and their one-time Aramean allies were centered around Damascus, another city which still exists, and is, again, the capital of a Syrian nation. But let's not get distracted with all that, just fun facts there. If we take the text directly at face value, now that the Amorites have submitted, Israel has, for no reason, decided to besiege and ultimately destroy their capital. No reason is given for this in the text. And yet, having looked at a bunch of Near Eastern history up to this point, we can say pretty clearly what happened. Between the end of chapter 19 and the start of chapter 20, there's been a time skip of somewhere between 1 and 10 years, during which period the Ammonites have decided that being vassals of Israel is a bum deal, and they rise up in rebellion. And there's only one penalty for rebellion in the ancient world: absolute destruction. We will see it in Jerusalem when they rebel against the Babylonians. Then it will happen again under the Romans, and here David is doing the exact same thing, taking the riches of the rebel town, extracting the people to be slaves, and destroying a great deal of what was good in the city. Except that while Chronicles suggests that David himself was out doing this, we hear from Samuel that actually it was Joab leading the army while David stayed home. Now, it is common enough in ancient chronicles like this to give the king credit, whether he was personally at the front or not, but here there is a slightly different motive in Chronicles, because in Samuel we hear that it was precisely because most of the fighting men were out while David was at home that he happened to spy a particularly attractive woman. Leonard Cohen would later write that you saw her bathing on the roof. And for generations, people have in their head that Bathsheba was taking a bath on the roof. But no, if you read the text a little more clearly without Leonard Cohen in your head, David's the one on the roof. And from that vantage point, he's able to peek in some window and see a scene that would not otherwise be visible in Bathsheba's bathroom. Now, the story of Bathsheba is famous, and for good reason, but it ultimately amounts to little more than gossip, a bit of political drama that, if not for the theological implications, would play no role in history at all. David falls in lust with Bathsheba, but she is married to Uriah the Hittite, a famous warrior in the kingdom. David tries various tricks to cover up his adultery and ultimately sends Uriah off to get killed in battle. Now then, David's clear to marry her, Bathsheba that is, not Uriah. But the prophet Nathan calls him out on it, and their first baby is stillborn at the command of God. The second baby is Solomon, who will, next episode, become king, although it seems that his mother's affair was well known in the court. All this happened during the months when the Ammonite capital was under siege. After that, Chronicles, ever concerned with religious affairs, records the story of the death of the last remnants of the giants of Philistia. And it is odd enough that I'm just going to read it for you. And after this, there arose war with the Philistines at Gezer. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants, and the Philistines were subdued. And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan, the son of Jair, struck down Lahmi, the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he also was descended from the giants. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimea, David's brother, struck him down. These were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Now, what's going on here? I have no idea. The recently departed Dr. Michael Heiser had a pretty elaborate and quite fun theory about these giants being the offspring of the heavenly rebellion in Genesis chapter 6. But we would need a fair bit of archaeological examination to bring that out of the realm of the theological and into the realm of the historical, as much as I am a fan of Dr. Heiser. Anyway, Chronicles at this point decides that it is pretty much done with David's career at this point and skips to the story of the temple. But Samuel still has some more war in store for David. And like all good ancient legends, it starts with rape. Now, David has a whole fistful of sons, most of whom never get more than a name in the histories, but the oldest of these sons is named Amnon. Being the oldest, he is the presumptive heir, though Scripture is careful never to suggest that anyone but Solomon was ever considered. And it turns out that Amnon has been watching way too much Japanese anime, and has developed a significant lust for his sister, Tamar. Now, this is probably a half-sister, not that it makes it any better. And so he does various things to try and trick her into his bed, and then he rapes her. Then she, of course, is deeply ashamed, and he is also in a bad state because, let's be honest, nothing good was ever going to come from a thing like this. Now, everyone knows what has happened, and everyone is extremely upset, but as is sometimes the way in families, no one's really sure what is appropriate to do, and the whole matter just simmers like a cancer for 2 years. Finally, Absalom, who had sort of taken charge over Tamar after her ordeal, gets an opportunity to kill Amnon, and then he flees into exile. King David is naturally upset that his son has murdered his other son, and even once he realizes why the murder happened, he's still sad that his children are killing each other. Of course, if it was hard to figure out what is right to do before, it's just as hard now. Should David ignore the attack on his daughter? Should he ignore the murder of his son? Should he forgive the exiled son? Ultimately, General Joab finds a wise woman to give a talk on the virtue of mercy, and after 3 years, David announces that Absalom should return from his exile. Except that even once Absalom is formally pardoned, David still can't bear to be in his presence, and for 2 more years, Absalom feels neglected. Remember, Absalom might now be the oldest remaining son. He might be the heir apparent, feel himself to be the heir apparent, even though we're never told that an heir has been selected at this point. Absalom does finally get his meeting, but he doesn't feel that it's timely. He doesn't feel that it's genuine. And so instead he goes to the gate of Jerusalem and he spends some time announcing to everyone he sees that David is failing in his duties as national judge. I mean, which may well have been the case because unlike wise Solomon, we don't ever seem to hear about David holding court or hearing cases. There's no doubt that he was hearing legal disputes to at least some extent. This was as much a duty of ancient Near Eastern kings as posing for photographs is a duty of modern presidents. But judging by his family life and psalms, he may have been more emotional than is perhaps wise, leaving some, perhaps, with grumblings that Absalom could exploit. Now, for a king's son to act as judge in the king's stead doesn't seem like something that would raise too many eyebrows, but David clearly just wasn't going to give Absalom the position, and perhaps gave him no position at all within the royal household, so Absalom goes elsewhere for the political power he needs to maintain his royal lifestyle. But David must have been failing in more than just his duties as judge. For after a few years of this agitation, Absalom goes over to Hebron, remember the old capital of the Judean tribe, and declares himself king of Israel. And it seems enough of the men of Israel agree with him on this that David is forced in short order to flee from Jerusalem itself. It has been speculated that the people who support Absalom may be wanting a return to the less centralized nature of the Israelite nation as it existed before Saul and David, which may be why Absalom was going around campaigning for a post as judge rather than as king, at least initially. After so many years of ceaseless war, plus the taxes, the palace immorality, and corvée labor that God himself warned the people would be the natural result of establishing kingship, there must have been a pretty significant group of people upset at the state of things. And while the timeline is difficult to establish exactly, it has been suggested that both the moving of the tabernacle to Jerusalem and Absalom's rebellion occurred near the end of David's reign, and the one may have inspired the other. For all of Saul's religious overreach, he never tried to combine the powers of priest and king into one, and his few abortive attempts to act at all like a religious leader, which kings were expected to be, were smacked down by Samuel. But here, David is bringing the central religious artifact to his new political capital instead of letting it wander around all of Israel as it had before, under Levitical direction. Whether or not this was authorized by God, it would surely have irritated people who were content with their traditional and perhaps less centralized faith. Perhaps most telling, though, as David flees Jerusalem, we get a listing of who goes with him. His core officers, at least some of them, are in the group, but also bands of Kerethites, Pelethites, and 600 men from Gath. We aren't sure who the Kerethites are, but they're probably not Israelites, instead some minor group of foreign mercenaries from the south. Pelethites are similarly debated, although there are linguistic connections suggesting that they're a group of Philistines. And of course, having 600 Gittites from Gath is extremely telling. David is relying on a core of foreign mercenaries to sustain his power. Interestingly, it is suggested in Samuel that the reason the Gittites, at least, are following David is out of Yahwistic piety, and that they may be converts. But there's no real way to know if they're truly in it for God or for Mammon, as they say. David gets heckled as he flees by some random guy who calls him a murderer of the house of Saul, which we haven't heard about yet because in the narrative it actually happens later. If we jump ahead to chapter 21, we hear about a famine in the land, caused because Saul attacked the Gibeonites, who had a treaty with Israel supposedly dating back to the time of Joshua's conquest. To rectify both the famine and the offense to the neighbors, David delivers 7 sons of Saul to be hanged, presumably 7 healthy ones capable of being a political threat, while preserving that disabled one who wasn't going to be a threat to him. Though the narrative puts this near the end of David's career, there are multiple reasons for thinking it happened fairly early, not least being this heckler. Just another example of chronology in Samuel being passed over and things being handled on a topical basis instead. But returning to the rebellion, Absalom enters Jerusalem about as soon as David abandons it and takes over the palace in such a way as to make it clear that he is claiming the crown. Then Absalom's advisors confer over whether to pursue David immediately or wait a bit, and they ultimately decide to wait, on the back of some poor advice which ends up being the wrong choice. David makes it over the Jordan, where we see that he's welcomed by a band of outcasts. One guy from the Ammonite capital, one guy from the backwater of Gilead, and one guy from a place so miserable it's apparently called the land of no pasture. David's not being supported here by internal elements, but by external alliances, as his army and people revolt against him. Anyway, Absalom does eventually follow across the Jordan River, bringing with his what seems to be mostly a native Israelite force, the citizen soldiers who make up the bulk of ancient armies. They have the advantage in numbers, but David's army is the professional corps, plus foreign mercenaries, and the true king of Israel uses this to his advantage. His army divides up into thirds and draws Absalom into the forest of Ephraim, a very broken and difficult area full of spots for ambush and guerrilla tactics. It does come to a pitched battle, and the superior skill of David's army wins out over the superior numbers of his son's national popular army, and it almost comes to a mass slaughter before General Joab thinks to put a stop to things as soon as the enemy leader is dead. Of course, at this point we get a famous bit of drama. Like a cartoon villain, David has ordered that Absalom be brought back to him, alive, so that they could rule the empire as father and son. And with Absalom's death, he's furious at General Joab. Joab shouts back that David needs to stop acting like a Hollywood scriptwriter who thinks death only matters when it happens to the main characters, and instead give a thought to the hundreds of loyal men who died at his orders. David then bows his head in shame. He thanks Joab and the Spirit of the Lord for imparting such wisdom, and he goes forth a better man and more righteous king of Israel. Wait, no. That would be the happy ending. Just kidding. He fires Joab and replaces him with the enemy general, because at least that guy didn't kill David's son. Joab is still a commander, but overall command goes to Amasa, at least for the moment. I say for the moment because soon enough, as they are walking back to Israel from the battle, the Judahites and the other tribes begin to argue about whether there should be rewards given at the end of the battle. Now, usually the victorious side in a war would plunder the losers. This is the big incentive for the regular soldiers to fight for a king. But because the reconciliation was so thorough, it seems likely that no one got any plunder, and even questions of the honor due a victorious warrior were raised. And so it seems a fellow named Sheba, son of Bichri, manages to lead most of the tribes in rebellion against the Judahites, even before they've all made it back home from the last rebellion. David orders his soldiers to chase after the rebels, while David himself goes to Jerusalem to reassert his authority. And remember that Absalom had asserted his authority in Jerusalem by sleeping with his father's concubines, and so there's a good chance that David was just going back to Jerusalem to show he was king by sleeping with a bunch of women. Anyway, while this is all happening, General Joab walks up to Chief General Amasa and stabs him in the gut to regain control of the army while they're in the wilderness. Then he lays siege to the town of Abel in Beth-Maachah until the people get tired of being besieged. They chop off the rebel leader's head and toss it over the walls to Joab. Problem solved, and everyone returns home happy, except of course for Amasa, who died from being stabbed in the gut. Now Samuel has more details about various heroes of David's army, records some of David's songs, and talks a bit more about fighting the Philistines, but we're pretty much at the conclusion of David's story. He really only has two things left to do with his life: build the temple and pass the throne on to Solomon. And if you weren't aware, he's going to do a poor job with both of these. For no clear reason, Samuel says it is because the Lord was angry, and Chronicles said that Satan filled David's heart. But whatever the case, King David decides to conduct a census of his people. Now, it had previously been made clear, back in the books of Moses, when all the laws were given, that God hates censuses. No one really knows why, but Scripture is more clear on this topic, giving it more examples and more attention than it is on the matter of homosexuality, for example. Anyway, David raises his hand in clear rebellion against the Lord by finding out basic statistical information on the inhabitants of his kingdom, principally for the purposes of taxation and military recruitment. Fortunately, David repents of this statistical gathering soon after. Thank goodness. And because of this quick repentance, God allows him to choose the preferred punishment. His options are famine, invasion, or plague, and he chooses a plague, which kills 70,000 people. Now, this wasn't a plague like COVID, where invisible viruses spread around and attack people. Rather, an angel of the Lord is physically walking around the town and pointing at people, and whoever he points to immediately falls ill and dies. The angel has a sword. How the sword is involved in this is unclear, but we can imagine all kinds of cool-looking things that would be in the movie. Anyway, David, meanwhile, goes up to the highest hill around, to Mount Moriah, and he begs the angel to stop. So the angel comes up to the mountain and ends the plague right there and then. Now that spot happens to be a threshing floor owned by a fellow named Araunah the Jebusite, called Araunah the Jebusite in Chronicles, or Ornan, but clearly the same person is intended despite multiple different spellings. At the urging of his royal prophet Gad, David purchases the land and sanctifies it for the future construction of the temple. Now what, from a secular point of view, could possibly be behind such a story, after so much of the life of David has been fairly plausible for a non-theistic historian? Who knows? We'll look at it next time. Because as far as the author of Samuel is concerned, now that his favorite king has gotten credit for founding the temple, the story's over. Excellent. And we can move on to the book of Kings. Chronicles, however, with its more explicit theological focus, wants to spend the next 8 chapters outlining all the preparations for building the temple. I'm going to read you every single line and discuss every last bit of temple preparation and all the theological and historical implications of each. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to skip basically all of that. I'm not going to read out all the family groupings of long dead Levites, because that would be terrible. But neither are we just going to skip ahead to the succession crisis between Solomon and Adonijah. Because the temple is really important. The faith of the people in Israel in this period of time is really important. And it's not just important for the people nowadays who follow the biblical faith, because, of course, good, faithful people are going to be interested in this stuff. How did the Israelites worship? But also it's important for understanding just what was going on in this period in history. So join us next time as we engage in some extreme temple building, invoking an unavoidable bit of theology, and pausing to ask the surprisingly difficult question, was David a priest? Thank you for listening.